Javier Perez Tasso.
Okay, so good morning, thank you. So yes, we're getting to the end of Cybers, and I hope you had a great week so far. So we're going to have, yet again, a tradition, which is starting with a thought leader, Diana Paredes. Speak Spanish as well, but we're not going to do it in Spanish this time. So we as you heard this week, we've had every morning a thought leader talking about one topic. Tim Berners-Lee on Tuesday, founder of the World Wide Web. Yesterday, Dr. Go as well on AI. So today we're going to have Diana, and we're very pleasure to have you here. And I'll say a few words about her in a minute. But just to put it into perspective, the RegTech area. So we've been hearing a lot about it this week. It's a hot topic. It's a hot topic because taking it a step back, if you look at the whole forces impacting essentially the transaction banking business, you see essentially three main ones. One, of course, is innovation. There's a lot happening. I will not go back to that. You've heard here as well a lot about it this week with a lot of competition, but as well collaboration between banks and fintechs. The second area is, of course, cyber. It's still front and center. Risks are not going away. They're here to stay, and we cannot be complacent, and that's why the industry is good to see that it is reacting. And the third one is the topic of today. Is essentially, RegTech is the whole regulation and financial crime compliance impact into the transaction banking business. And RegTech, well, we've heard a lot this week that RegTech plays a major role. There are RegTech factories having a way helping the industry industrialize financial crime compliance. And we've seen that RegTech is booming in many different ways. Obviously, Diana will tell us more about the number of billions invested into the RegTech industry, but it's close to 5 billion over the past 4 years. And yes, as I said, it is great to have her here because she's an authority. She actually has proven it with facts. And she created a company just 3 years ago, launching a software platform to address regulatory data. And 3 years later, she's in the top 50 fintech, profitable startup, which is also important. So without further ado, Diana, can you please join us on stage?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for waking up this morning after whatever parties you went to last night. So I'm really happy that we can start the day speaking about RegTech. So we're Suede, and I'm the CEO of the company. And our motto has been to bridge the regulatory gap through modern technology. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with you guys this morning was to really demystify what RegTech was all about, right? So how do you make sense of RegTech? Like Javier was saying, it's a huge movement. There's a lot of people talking about it. So really trying to understand overall what it really means to be, one, a RegTech, but also what it can mean for the industry, and also for the people here who are buyers or maybe vendor solutions themselves to really have a good think about how this movement effectively will affect their businesses in the long run. So when you are a RegTech, you should really ask yourself for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, how do you prevent the next financial crisis? This is really where everything started. When it comes to RegTech, you're always talking about the financial crisis and the consequences of the regulation that came afterwards. And the reality is that the only way forward is regulation. And for us as a company, when we started, this approach of basically trying to avoid arbitraging the regulation, to stop trying to avoid it, but actually instead to embrace the regulation was just starting. So we've really been able to ride the wave, I guess, of support or in trying to use more regulation to the advantage of your own companies. And that's been very exciting. So the question then you have to ask yourself, because you're trying to prevent the next financial crisis, and regulation is the answer for that, is fundamentally, what do the regulators want? What are they really asking from the industry? Where are they really trying to go? What is the spirit of the rule? And it's all about data. They fundamentally want to know your data. They want to know who is the next Lehman Brothers. They want to be able to supervise and compare from one financial institution to the other what is actually going on in the industry. So the thing with data, right, so regulatory data, this very crucial information for the industry, when you think about the pre-crisis kind of environment, you're really looking at a very one-dimensional flow of data between the different departments, between your systems. The regulation was really an afterthought. It was not something that you had to really think or plan too much for. Since the crisis, obviously, now the regulation itself is basically really requiring this data flow to go from one system to the other, let alone from one department to the other. And so this approach of just putting one script on top of one script to get this data to flow doesn't really work. And this is where, if you think about it, the systems that failed in 2008 to give us the warning signals that we were just about to have the industry exploding are the same ones pretty much that we have in place in our industry right now. And so that's the kind of stuff that also worries the regulators fundamentally. So when you think of it, RegTech, what the regulation is really asking for the industry is actually quite good. Right? So the way we look about regulation and the way we look about technology is that regulation is really the best excuse to spend money, to bite the bullet, and really revamp your systems in a powerful way. So really putting the regulation at the very core. And that's what's really exciting, because fundamentally you're going to have to spend that money. So why not do it in a way where you're really, really investing for the future, for something that can let this data flow go from one place to the other. So when you think about RegTech, this is where companies like ours are doing a lot of work. But when you go from regulatory reporting to AML to KYC to cybersecurity, all of that is RegTech. So all of these companies and this movement of better approaches around technology come around really trying to understand building technology with the spirit of the rule in mind. The future. So it's not so much that the data has to just flow from one system to the other, right? It needs to flow from one financial institution to the other, to the regulators, from one regulator to the other, and very quickly you realize that you're ending up with this matrix of data that has to travel across our industry. And realistically, this is nowhere near to what's possible today. Right? So how do you make sure that you end up with this picture where at some point in our financial industry, we have this data flowing from one place to the other? So that's really what we think the industry needs. It really needs to ask itself very important questions around improved communication, but fundamentally, much more innovation. Right? How do we get to better innovation in financial services? And how do we really get to this post-crisis banking of the future? And that's what RegTech is all about. So when you think about the trends in regulation, it's not just about the data, right? It's about this big data. Our big clients or our small clients all have big data problems, right? So that's a reality that we need to become better at handling this data overall. But then there's a huge problem because a lot of the systems in the industry cannot really cope with the frequency of change. So the regulators are also changing at a much faster pace than ever before. So our systems need to be able to cope with this pace of change much better as well. Effectively, every time the regulation is changing, people are throwing money and resources, wasting it without really inherently changing anything. So the winners at the end of this day are going to be the institutions that realize the fastest to cope with this pace of change without just expending their money and not doing very much for it. So the cost, everyone, hopefully in this room will agree that the regulatory cost is atrocious. Everyone is complaining about it all the time, and fundamentally, I think everyone in their heart believes that it should be much cheaper. And so that's actually a reality for the industry, because one of the reasons that it's not is because of the lack of transparency, the lack of auditability, systems that are black boxes that you can't do anything with, right? So when you think about transparency, that is the core of what the regulators are trying to get us to do. They want systems that they can audit. They want systems that they can supervise. And so fundamentally, systems that can programmatically be interrogated is the way forward. So more transparency is definitely the right approach. So when you're a tech company, and we're very proud, people sometimes call us the Google of regulation, which we think is obviously a huge compliment for any tech company. But effectively, it's a good thing to ask yourself, when you're in technology, what would Google do? Right? And the reason this is very important is because in financial services, we have been very complacent. We have been lazy. We have tolerated to have terrible systems inside our organizations, whereas our phone can do things a lot faster. And so fundamentally, you need to require almost the same things inside your organizations that you can get from your apps on your phone. Why wouldn't you? right? So what would Google do? And so Google is very interesting because in many ways they deal with a lot of data. They do a lot of things where effectively they cope with the pace of change very well. They also do a lot of things for free. So the reduction in cost of a lot of things that we have available is actually quite crucial. And so it's very interesting to realize that fundamentally their approach to building technology as well is very transparent. So if you think about it from what will Google do perspective, and they deal a lot with data. So there's a great example from them. They got a fund from the money from the World Bank in 2006 to organize transport data. They decided to try to solve that problem for the industry. So how did they decide to do that? They effectively decided to regulate transport data. And so it's very interesting to remember when you think about technology, and obviously this is what we're trying to come back to. So you're trying to bring technology for regulation, right? This is what the conversation of RegTech is all about. And so the reason that we have all these applications on the back of this project that Google did for, with transport authorities is because every single transport authority in the world publishes their data from their bus schedules to distances in that standard that Google created in 2006. And all the innovation it made possible is huge, right? I'm sure you guys all have these in your phones. And so it's so important to remember that standards make software possible, which is also why it's such a privilege to present this here at Swift, because obviously this organization is all about that, about producing standards for our industry, trying to make things that can be much more of a utility that fundamentally reduces the cost, but also fundamentally promotes really innovation. So standards make software possible. And what's interesting is that when you think about technology, it's always standards upon standards, right? So Google itself obviously leverages on, JavaScript, CSS, the standards we have in HTML. The internet that we take so much for granted is pure standards everywhere, CSV. And in the financial industry, we're used to standards. Obviously, Swift is the epitome of that. But every time that there's been a huge leap in the way that we interact and that we transfer data from one part to the other, it has been thanks to standard. So Swift, with bank-to-bank messaging, in electronic trading fix, and the era of derivatives was possible thanks to FPML. And now we are in the era of regulation. This is a new era, so we need regulatory standards. It's extremely important. And so then you take also the other question, so what is RegTech? Everyone is talking about it. Fundamentally, the best definition you can get about RegTech should come from a regulator, so we took the one that the FCA has. And so the FCA is interesting because they've been doing a lot of things in the UK around innovation. They have a competition agenda. They really try to promote innovation overall. And so their definition about RegTech was, RegTech applies to new technologies developed to help overcome regulatory challenges in financial services. RegTech applies to new technologies. So we're talking about new technologies, right? And that's the reality. And we need to bite the bullet and accept that there's a lot of things available in other industries that we need to bring to financial services. And we're talking about good practices and standards where the technology comes first, where fundamentally you're trying to move away from vendor addiction, from situations where you can't actually have interoperability from one system to the other. And it is fantastic that fundamentally the regulator is really forcing us as an industry to go in that direction as well, because if we do this correctly, we can get super tech in our industry, which is the stuff that we get excited about. So good practices, there's a few basics that we really don't have enough in our industry. So all the panels you have been going through the week, it's come up again and again, open banking, open architecture. That is so important. Tech talent is so scarce in the industry. It's almost madness to think that one single organization is going to have access to all the best tech talent in the world, unless they're Google. because the financial industry is not as popular to actually get these developers to come and work with them. So how can we actually get better innovation, much more applications to be built for our organizations, actually by having open architecture, by being able to tap on the talent across the industry, and the only way to do that is by having systems that are interoperable, that are much more open, and that allow for interaction with people that know nothing about finance, because someone that's a developer shouldn't need to know about finance in order to build regulatory applications, let alone just applications in general for the industry. API-driven architecture, it's extremely important. So we've talked about it again and again. There was a panel that was fantastic about APIs that I saw the other day that was literally one of the banks saying they had to look at PSD2, and they took that as the opportunity to start looking at their API architecture. So anything that you cannot programmatically interrogate is fundamentally more legacy. It's fundamentally more scripts. It's fundamentally a node in the matrix of data that's supposed to move from one place to the other that will not be able to do that because of that kind of system. So having API-driven architecture, something that can really allow for this digitization in the conversation, is extremely important. The cloud. So I don't know why anyone decided to call this the cloud, because there's nothing more confusing than that. There's a huge education process that needs to happen around the cloud and the realities and the power that can do for our industry. But any system that in the future cannot easily move to the cloud as a copy-paste is going to create you problems. Because whether we like it or not, at some point or the other, even the big institutions are going to feel very comfortable to move their things to the cloud. And anything you're buying now that cannot do that easily is going to cost you a lot of money in the future. Interoperability, I was speaking about that before, but fundamentally this approach of having this legacy, one system with the other, in bed with the other, to have another project of 5 years to do things, that doesn't work. Right? Fundamentally, again, you will stumble upon a reality because the regulation is not going to tolerate that. It's not going to tolerate that you have to have this particular vendor solution in order to be able to do a submission. So systems really should be interoperable. They should deliver because of the fundamental goodness of their technology, not because they create vendor addiction. And that's very important. So RegTech, in many ways, is about these good practices, but it is about collaboration. And the winners are going to be the people that really get the utility opportunity that there is in the industry when it comes to regulation. What is the thing we don't have to compete with each other against? It's regulation. There is so much in the rule where everyone has to do the same thing. So the more utility approaches, and the beautiful thing with standards is that they're supposed to be free and good and usable by everyone in the industry, the more collaboration can happen. So in the UK, for example, one of the first times that RegTech was mentioned was in the FinTech Future. So it was actually a document that was produced by GoScience. And the word RegTech was mentioned as one of the things that will be the future of the industry, and that was in 2014. We participated in that, so it was obviously a great privilege as a young company to really be part of those conversations from the beginning. But you see that there is more and more these conversations around International RegTech Association, European Cloud Alliance, effectively bodies that are really trying to lobby in a powerful way to regulators as well, to legislation, to actually get better things for the technology space. And so collaboration versus this too big to fail kind of conversation is actually quite important, because even the solutions that will win are going to be the ones that are the most interoperable, that are the most collaborative, that are the ones that, are not closing themselves because they think they're too big to fail. Because I think if there's anything we've learned from the financial crisis is that everyone can be too big to fail. The other thing is obviously around data standards. Fantastic work, obviously always done by Swift. We actually started a project in financial regulatory data standards with the European Commission. And so again, it's not about reinventing the wheel. So we leverage on all this wonderful work that's done by institutions like Swift, LEIs, but we try to translate it into a format that can be used by developers. So the reason that it's been quite successful is because we need a format that developers that don't know anything about finance can actually use to create tech. Right? So the guys who created City Mapper or Journey Planners or all of that stuff, they don't know anything about a bus, but they can still create the app. right? So it's a bit crazy that in our industry we think that people need to know so much more to create technology when we have such a scarce resource of developers. So standards are very important because they allow this. And eventually, I'm hoping, if at some point properly the regulators listen to us, we will end up with them also putting things in formats that are much more digital, that can actually be consumed by pure developer kind of practice. And the other thing is publishing standards. So we lobby heavily on that because it's almost a tragedy what you find in the industry with people copying and pasting the links where they have to actually click through in order to actually find what regulation they're supposed to apply for the next month. And then when that changes, nobody knows that it's changed. And all of these things are extremely manual again. So publishing standards is a funny one because it could be extremely easy to put in place. And what we're finding interesting is that with our interaction with regulators, from when we started the company to where we are now, everyone has a fintech team, if not even a RegTech team. So it is quite exciting to see that the responsibility the regulators have in this change is also something that they're taking seriously, or at least they're listening, which is already a good place to be. But from the FCA to the Singaporean authority, the Australian regulator, these have probably been the ones that have been the most upfront about trying to look closely at innovation. But there is loads of things that are happening across the industry, of course, in Canada as well, and the European Central Bank. So it's really exciting because fundamentally, the spirit of the rule is not just for the other side of the coin. It's not just for the financial institutions. It's also the opportunity for the regulators. And some people have started speaking about subtech for supervisory technology. I'm not sure if that's the best word for it, but they're going with it. But effectively, it is what can technology do for the supervisors? What can technology do for the regulators themselves, right? And so then, what is really exciting, right, what I find overall very exciting with technology, is that it almost doesn't matter who you are. What matters is the fundamental of what you're delivering to the industry, the technology you're delivering to the industry. So when you think about RegTech, the objectives of RegTech and why it's so important, right, is because you're really trying to get to this improved regulatory data matrix. So where this data, and if you remember the drawing of this matrix of data that had to go from one place to the other, well, that's not a dream anymore. That's actually a reality that becomes something possible. Because technology now can actually do that. The problem is that we don't have the right equipment to do it in our industry, right? And so you're really trying to get to this flow of information because quality, controls and governance on financial institutions is a must. It's a requirement. We cannot turn our back to that because of 2008, where you're trying to really get comparability for supervision, right? How are the regulators supposed to know there is another Lehman Brothers if they cannot compare from one bank to the other what they're actually doing? So RegTech is extremely essential also for the other side of the coin, like we were saying. And then this seamless integration for fintechs and third parties. So interoperable systems are going to be the ones that win. Because fundamentally, tech wins. We're going to move away, very likely, from big projects of professional services-driven kind of approaches to something that can very easily connect with each other. Because that is how an app on the phone transfers its data. And that is fundamentally where the regulation is also forcing all of us to go. And that's a good thing. We should be excited about that because we're going to have to bite the bullet to get much better technology in place that actually makes us compliant. So ultimately, all of this, and what RegTech is all about from my perspective, is really about a much more transparent, stable, and cheaper financial system. Cheaper financial system for the consumer, having better access to better technology, simply because it's actually possible. Simply because it's finally possible to create better technology for financial services. So fundamentally, I really think that we need to embrace the RegTech movement. It's a revolution. I'm obviously very excited, as you can see, about what's happening to our industry, because it also has meant that a company like ours that started from nothing can be something. Right? And that's what innovation is all about. Because one of the things that I think sometimes we miss in financial services is that we think that people have to have been around for a long time to deliver value. And actually, those companies that have been around for a long time should learn much better to play with the smaller and younger companies because they are nimble, because they are agile, and fundamentally, they can really create good point solutions to problems that are very hard to create in big organizations. So in the worst of cases, when you collaborate with a young company or a fintech or a RegTech, you're really looking at an opportunity to get much cheaper R&D than what you could be doing. So looking at these opportunities and what interoperability and open systems can actually do for the industry, the innovation it can bring, the movement of better tech that it can bring for financial services, and taking that seriously is very important. And thinking and realizing that regulation is fundamentally the best excuse to free ourselves from legacy systems is also very exciting. So that's for me. So thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day.
Starting in here in a few minutes. Thank you.